I guess I'll like go over like my story first, and then I'll like put it into the context of the UN definitions of human trafficking, and then we'll go into like the history, and then we'll like go into how I think this conversation should be had and possible solutions for the issue. So my name is Maya Morena. My real name is Catherine Ochoa. I don't really hide who I am anymore, but I grew up feeling really ashamed of who I was. I grew up feeling ashamed of being undocumented, and later as I became a sex worker, I was ashamed of that too, and that's because society teaches you to be ashamed of those things. Yes.
Oh, can you just either stand up or walk a little louder?
Yes. No problem. Okay. Whew. So I'm going to start off by talking about just like my history, being an undocumented immigrant and a sex worker, and then I'm going to apply it to UN definitions of human trafficking, and then we're going to go over like how I think this conversation can best be had, and what I think the possible solutions for this issue are. So my name is Maya Morena. My real name is Catherine Ochoa. I was originally born in Honduras, in Trujillo. I lived very differently from most people in my country. I lived on a mountain, and it was in a farm, and it was in a rainforest. We used to do our laundry in the stream that came from this waterfall. So we had these boulders, and we would take the clothes and put it in the water, and we would rub it up against the rocks, and it was a great childhood. It was very freeing. I think it's the closest to freedom I ever got, because I could do whatever I wanted. I could explore nature and be in touch with myself as a human being and be connected to the world around me and not see everything as a property or something with money attached to it. It was just, I was nature and nature was me, and this was my world, and we were living off the land. I stayed with my grandparents in a choza, which is a house made out of like mud and stuff like that. But unfortunately, my grandmother was murdered. So there was a bunch of men that came by the house, and they shot my grandmother twice. And my grandfather tried to hide me away from what was happening. He like pushed me against a corner. But unfortunately, I did see her fall, and because of the corruption in our country, we couldn't call the police. So we ended up hoisting her up on one of the beds, and the bed was white, so I saw like the blood go onto the pillow, and we had to sleep with her like that until the morning came, and we had to tell everyone else in the village that she had passed away, and we buried her. News got to my parents, who were in the US during the time. They were in Long Island, New York. They had received temporary protected status, TPS. So instead of giving a pathway to citizenship for immigrants, what the US decided to do was start temporary work visas. So they kept certain people in a permanent state of not having any status at all. But the only thing they were allowed to do was work in the US. And they could be deported at any time. So TPS, which is something that Trump has tried to eliminate for all the countries, including Ecuador, El Salvador, Haiti, and Honduras. So my parents had that, and they were working here, and they were renewing it every year. And they got word that my dad's mother had been murdered. And they realized that they couldn't stay with their original plan of saving up enough money and going back home and providing me with a good life. So they thought to themselves, it's too dangerous for her to stay here. So maybe it's worth the risk to bring her here, because at least then we'll have a chance of being reunited, because her life is very much in danger right now. So they saved up $10,000, and they paid a coyote, a smuggling business, to transport me over. My dad's brother, they made plans, and I was taken to live with my aunt and my uncle. And my uncle is the one who started the process, so he gave me over to a family. So the way the coyote organizations work is there's somebody running it, and it runs like any other business, accounting, all that other stuff. There's people that go around and hire people. So if you have a house, they might like go to you and say, hey, would you mind if we try to like, could you house somebody temporarily so we could get them to this place? And kind of like an Airbnb, they get paid a certain amount to house somebody for a temporary amount of time in their room. And this might be a family or just a single person, but they get hired and you get sent from house to house to house, and people trade you until they can't house you anymore because there's no more houses, and it's just the terrain that you need to walk through in order to cross. So then they would hire what's called a traveler, and those people are the ones that guide a group of migrants that have been staying in other houses and guide them through wherever they need to go. Sometimes they pay also, vans or trains, whatever it may be, to escort migrants to where they need to go. So I started that process, and my uncle left me at a stranger's house. And I felt that he was about to leave me, and I started crying. I was like, you can't leave me like my grandparents left me. So he promised me that he wouldn't, and we slept together that night. And when I woke up, he was gone. And I was with the family, and there was a little girl there, because it was a family, and she's like, don't worry, you're going to be fine. I'm going to show you the place. This is the kitchen. Do you want anything? You want some soup? So it wasn't too bad. But there were some houses where I was touched inappropriately, and things happened. So it's a weird combination, because I was a kid. I couldn't really consent, but I knew what was going on somewhat, not completely. Some of the situations were good. I've had people treat me nicely and give me piggyback rides and give me ice cream and try to teach me alphabets. I've had other people touch me inappropriately, having me sit on their lap and touch my body while watching TV. So it depended on the place that I was in. At some point, I was with a group of migrants, and we were in the process of crossing the US border. So to give you an idea, I went from Honduras, I had to cross Mexico, and then I had to cross the USA. So at one point, I was in a clearing, and the guy who was the main traveler, who was guiding us through it, told me, if we get caught, you have to tell them that I'm your dad, and she's your mom. And I just said, okay. There was a big light looking for outsiders there that I saw. And the next thing I know, we were caught. And a border agent was coming over to me, and he kind of got down on his knees, and he's like, hi, talking in my Spanish language. And he's like, that guy over there says he's your dad. Is that true? And I said, no. He's like, okay, sweetie. So he gets up, and they get thrown in jail. And I get fingerprinted. I get my photo taken. I was about 5 years old during that time. And I get put in jail too. I didn't really, I was 5, so I didn't really understand. But I knew where I was. I knew I was behind bars. And I guess I'm going to put some context here. Border Patrol created a policy called prevention through deterrence during the Clinton administration. Prevention through deterrence means that they block off the areas where migrants usually go to, and that's usually the urban areas where all the jobs are and where it's easy to pretty much go through. It's an easy pathway. They blocked off those areas, so you would have to go through deadly terrains, and that way they could kind of put border enforcement onto nature. So you would naturally be in a state where you could die. So what ends up happening is a lot of migrants have to cross through the desert near Arizona. And in that desert, there's an anthropologist that studies this, and he has found that you could easily die of dehydration. Not only that, but they've done experiments with animals that are close to animals, and they dress them up in migrant clothes. And they find that within hours or days, there are vultures circling the animals, and they pick apart until there is nothing left, even the bone, because the critters and the vultures eat them alive. So there is no evidence that death had occurred. And at the border, it is really a weaponized mass murder machine. Thousands of people have died on the journey. It is a risk that you have to take. And the kind of justification for this is that we are illegal immigrants. We knew the risk that we were taking. We were given a deterrence, and because we took that risk, then we deserve the consequences of it. And that is the justification that they use for that. Now, under this policy, it's meant to detract the bad illegal immigrants, the traffickers, but unfortunately, the way that it is applied, they don't care if you're innocent, if you're being trafficked. They don't care if you're a 5-year-old child that's walking through, just trying to get to their family. So it's kind of like the way that we try to stop terrorism with drone attacks. A drone is not going to tell the difference between a civilian and a terrorist. So you end up killing both, but mostly civilians. Those are the ones that end up dying the most. So that's the policy that's been in place. They have also worked with Mexico and Honduras to try to increase border enforcement in all the countries. So these policies get exported to other countries as well, and it's a requirement to get aid. In order for other countries to get aid, they have to put in anti-human trafficking laws, border security, they have to privatize their land, and they have to let US companies use their resources and their workers. So that's a requirement. And that is why a lot of people have been leaving Honduras, because of the US intervention policies that have been implemented and the military coups that have been happening for several years now. So I was in jail, and the only thing they give you to eat in Border Patrol custody is Austin crackers, if you know what that is. That's a policy to this day. That's the only thing they give you to eat, knowing that they are trying to kill you, and that by the time you get there, you might be too dehydrated and you might die right in front of them. That's the only thing they give you to eat, and that's what they gave me through cell bars to eat as a 5-year-old. There's no hug policy. Border Patrol is not trained to take care of children. They are violent agents of the state. That's what they are. After that, they questioned me. I was lucky because even though I was 5, my aunt had taught me to memorize my parents' full legal name. So they were able to track down my parents. But other kids are not so lucky. So other kids have to defend themselves in court, and they get deported, and other things might happen to them. They might just be given up for adoption for a family here and never see their parents ever again. But I memorized it because my aunt had taught it to me in my country. So I told them my parents' name, they were able to track them down, and then I went to court. The judge couldn't change my status, so I stayed undocumented, illegal, for the rest of my life, since I was 5 because of that. I grew up hating myself. Grew up thinking that I was a criminal because that's the way I was defined. Now the idea is that like these kids are innocent and they're being trafficked, but the law doesn't really care. You're a criminal nonetheless. You're still illegal and you're still not entitled to things. So I grew up really hating myself and trying to prove that I was perfect, that they were wrong about me, that I could be this perfect victim that I needed to be even considered worthy of a pathway to citizenship. And I started to realize that playing that game is a losing game because there really is no such thing as a perfect victim. So eventually I started to get into sex work, and that was about when I was 19, 20. But I really decided to dive in during 2016. And the reason for that is because I started to realize that because of the anti-immigrant hatred that was rising, and because Trump might get elected, that DACA could end. It got passed in 2012, and that is when I graduated high school. I had a 3.8 GPA, I took AP classes, I was an honors kid, I did like internships at the Daily News and other places. I thought I was going to be a good kid and like get into these high prestigious schools. And I ended up getting into good schools and getting scholarships, despite the fact that I can't apply to most scholarships because I'm not a US citizen. So no financial aid, no government loans, those things weren't an option to me, and I didn't end up going to school because it just was too difficult. I worked for AT&T, Oculus, and Bose. Every single company that I worked for was exploitative. Every single company told me to lie to customers. I knew that they were breaking antitrust and anti-monopoly laws, and I had to lie and do exploitative things. And I got paid a horrible salary, worked a lot of hours, and made like maybe $7.50 an hour or $10 an hour. It just wasn't enough to survive. And with DACA possibly being removed because Trump has been trying to get rid of it, I realized that I might very well need to work underground and establish a career underground so that I could stay alive and maybe support my parents. Even my parents had to think about that too, especially because TPS was also, he was trying to terminate that too for Honduras. So my father said, no matter what, I'm gonna work here because I have to pay this mortgage. I have 2 little sisters, they're both in high school. They're US citizens. So they're going to be fine, but they still need us to support them. So my father said no matter what, he's going to work under the table if he has to. But it's just better to not because you have more protection even when you have a temporary work visa. So that was the deal with that. At one point I did run away from home and I fell in love with a guy. And the relationship didn't go so well. He would threaten to kill himself if I didn't do what he wanted. He would use me in ways I'd rather not talk about. But it was a domestically abusive relationship and the police were not helpful. I had the police actually tell me that I was a victim of human trafficking and that this is how it works, that they make you fall in love with them and then they trick you into working in some industry and they take you overseas or something. And I started to realize that one of the things that they're doing is they're conflating domestic violence with human trafficking. And even in my domestic violence center that I was trying to get into on Long Island, on their human trafficking page, they have right next to it, human trafficking, prostitution. And one of the reasons they say that people are victims of human trafficking is because of a bad upbringing, not having good role models, having low self-esteem, things like that, which is very kind of victim-blamey to me. It just didn't feel right. But unfortunately, that is what law enforcement and a lot of these other people are trained to do by a lot of these anti-trafficking organizations. For instance, Polaris. Polaris is the #1 human trafficking organization in the US. According to them, most victims of human trafficking are US citizens. And most trafficking happens in the sex industry. This is because they're really biased. They are based mostly in the US, they mostly speak English. They also work with the Department of Homeland Security that works for ICE. So a lot of their programs, they work with hotels and they have a number to call for human trafficking and it's ICE. So obviously somebody like me will never call them no matter what, no matter how exploitative it gets. My father has worked the fields, making, picking fruits for people, working the fields for farmers. He's done that for $5 an hour under the table. He's worked other exploitative jobs. He's gotten injured at his work and couldn't do anything because he's undocumented. And then, working with a citizen, that citizen was able to sue and was able to get compensated. So unfortunately, we have this system where we treat certain people as underclass and we don't give them rights, but then we act like we're helping them and we're protecting them when we aren't. One of the people that is a big human trafficking, he has a whole organization called Our Underground Railroad, I believe. I think it fell asleep. Sorry, everyone. Okay. I wish I had a slideshow. I think that would be more effective. I think I'll go over the UN definition. That might be okay. Sorry if I'm talking too much.
Oh, keep going.
Oh my gosh, okay. So usually when politicians and journalists talk about human trafficking, they talk about it as a vastly global criminal business. It claims millions of victims every year. It's the modern slave trade. There's a couple of issues I have with it, and it's the fact that it treats it as if it's separate from immigration and from other industries. It mainly ties it with the sex industry. It also treats it like it's an individual problem, like there are individual people out there who are bad and they take a victim and they enslave them for profit. So they don't think in terms of systems. They don't think that the only legalized form of slavery we have in this country is our prison system. They don't think about how slavery has evolved over the years. So if you look back on slavery, chattel slavery of African Americans in the US, right? The slaves were also working the same jobs that poor white people were working. But the white people thought they were better than the African Americans, despite doing the same exact work, because at least they weren't a slave. So it's this weird kind of thing where we have a labor force that are both doing the same thing and are both being exploited. But because this person is labeled something else, oh, well, I'm better than that person, so I don't need to fight this. Even though they could team up together and overthrow the oppressive system that is exploiting both of them. There's also like the system of sharecropping that continued on after slavery, or the literacy laws. Let me see what it was here. The vacancy laws? Vacancy laws, yeah. I'm trying to see if I can find it. Yes. Vagrancy laws were used during the colonial times to prevent former slaves from migrating up north and to keep them dependent on the plantation owners. Vagrancy laws are the laws we still have in place. It criminalizes you being homeless. It criminalizes you just walking around and wandering. This is also like a law that can be used to charge sex workers because you're just walking around and soliciting. So vagrancy. It's also used against runaway teenagers. But back in the day when it first was introduced, it was used to prevent slaves from running away. And it kept them dependent on the plantation orders, even through a system of sharecropping as well. I think I'm going to go over like the history of this. So back in the day, during the progressive era, there wasn't just the prohibition on alcohol that they were fighting for. They had a philosophy that the state and police could control social morality through violence and imprisonment. And one of the things that they targeted was obviously drugs and obviously the sex industry in this way. But there was a very popular myth back in the day. It's called the white slave myth. So one of the things they passed was the Page Act of 1875. It was an anti-prostitution law, but it was also phrased in such a way that it was as a protection to make sure that women weren't forced into labor. But what it ended up doing is essentially banning Chinese women from the country. Because the idea that pushed this was that Chinese women are immoral and they're bringing about sexual, bad things. And they're because of their inferior culture. So they were banned from the country using this method, and one of the ways they would do that is before they were able to immigrate, they had to prove that they were moral women, and they were found not to be. One of the things that they said was that 9 in 10 women were polygamists and prostitutes. I wonder if I could find that report for you. This report was called the Report of the Royal Commissions on Chinese Immigration. It was written in 1885. The president, Ulysses S. Grant, said that polygamy should be banished from the land and that Chinese women who arrived did not pursue honorable and useful occupations. Ulysses wanted Congress to drive out licensed immorality. And this led to violent police crackdown of Hispanics in Chinese neighborhoods. But after that, the myth kept growing. So the myth became that Chinese men were luring women into a career in prostitution, white women, because Chinese women were at this point banned. So they were luring white women into prostitution and destroying America because of it. And that this whole plot was because of the Jews. And this led to violence happening in Jewish neighborhoods. So this kind of goes back to what's happening at the border with the idea that, Central American immigrants are coming here to destroy America, and it's all a big plot of Soros, the Jews. So there's the connection. There's also the Mann Act, with MANN Act. It's still a law to this day, so if you're found to be doing sex work and you're an immigrant, you could be banned for 10 years automatically. The same principle applies for that, which is that they're trying to protect you, kind of thing. So in order to ban Chinese men, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which you probably heard of, but they could not pass the Chinese Exclusion Act without first passing the Page Act. So this discriminated against LGBT immigrants, sex workers, and women of foreign nationality. The FBI also had a white slave division during the time, so they would go to local brothels under the guise that they were trying to protect women who were there against their will, who were slaves. They didn't find many, but what they did find was immigrants. They asked what their racial makeup was, and that was the real design of the program, was to deport anyone who was a migrant there. So the reason why they were called the White Slave Division is because you are not allowed to be in the sex industry if you were not white. You were deported. And that's what the FBI did back in the day. I'm sorry if this is too much. The Department of Homeland Security currently has the Blue Campaign. The Blue Campaign is their campaign for human trafficking. If you look at the ads for sex trafficking, it's mostly white women in their ads. In fact, if you go on Google and you look up sex trafficking, they're all white women with like a dark figure covering her face, or like a beautiful skinny white girl. Usually they get girls between the ages of like 5 and 12 years old to pose for these photos. I want you to understand that when you look at this, you are looking at an ad. It is not reality. Government officials and nonprofit organizations came together and they hired people for these advertisements. These slogans that you see on them, like, I didn't know that I could call the police, doesn't come from anywhere. It's an advertisement. They came up with the slogan. There's no story behind it. So it's really heartbreaking, because we have now with our government that they're detaining children, that they are treating them horribly. They're putting them through all the conditions you would call trafficking, but they're not calling it trafficking. Trying to find the definition. Sorry if I keep pausing and stopping. So the definition of human trafficking consists of the action of trafficking. It means the recruitment, transportation, transferring, and harboring and receipt of a person. It's through force, deception, abuse of power, and position of vulnerability. This is the UN definition. The purpose of trafficking is always exploitation. And you have to understand that under this definition, it falls under illegal immigration. That's where they place it under. And according to them, if you are a child, then you can't consent to anything, and use of fraud or anything like that doesn't count. You're a human trafficking victim by default. So under this definition, I am technically a human trafficking victim, but I don't get treated that way by law. On my website, I actually show the numbers of what this actually does. So on average, about 60 to 80,000 women are put into prison for prostitution. That isn't counting all the other charges that frequently go with that, which is vagrancy laws and the other laws as well. So that's just for prostitution, and not all police agencies report their numbers, so those numbers are higher. About 1,000 to 2,000 children are put into prison for prostitution. Usually children of color. I've read a report by the police that say that usually when they deal with children of color, they tend to just treat them like criminals anyway. And that's just an issue that they have in law enforcement. And there's just, I can't even tell you the numbers of people that they deport for this. So in comparison, the people who are able to get a human trafficking visa is about 200. About 2,000 are able to start an investigation, only 200 completed. There is no real effort to improve immigration or to make it easier. Instead, all the effort is being put into policing and imprisonment, and that's why we have the biggest number of people behind bars in the world, and we consider ourselves a beacon of freedom. We say that we're freeing the slaves. I can't say that that's really accurate at all. And unfortunately, what we're having with anti-trafficking organizations, not all of them, but most of them, is that they work with the government, they work with the feds, they work with ICE, and a lot of the times they have businesses where they take these women who are criminalized, they're under police custody, they are felons now because of the charges, and they put them to work, and that is the rehabilitation. These reformeries were in place since the progressive era. They have never worked. A lot of women leave, run away, or they go back to sex work because of the way the economy is, and because of their criminalized status, they can't get regular jobs. So I'm going to actually show you one of these organizations, but there's so many of them that I could go through a whole list. This organization I'm going to show you has inspired 40 other organizations that supposedly help victims of human trafficking. They only house 28 women. Oops. Okay, they only house 28 women. You have to apply to get in. You can't be pregnant. You can't have children. They want to make sure that you can work with their program, and you have to commit to 2 years of work. I did the math. They get paid maybe $20 or less. The organization itself makes $6 million in profit from this. Every single, as you can see, you can come up here and see it if you want to. It's called Thistle Farms. And as you can see, it's a whole shop. This is the main website, so it's a shop. And when you click on a product, they tell you that your purchase is helping them, so your impact. Your purchase of this body butter directly impacts the healing and empowerment of women survivors of prostitution, trafficking, and addiction. Because of customers like you, in 2018, we housed 21 survivors, employed 54 survivors, helped 9 survivors move into their own apartment, provided medical and mental health appointments, and supported the employment of over 1,200 women in the global partnerships. Now, I don't think this is gonna eradicate human trafficking, because in my point of view, housing and medical care should be a universal human right. Everyone should have access to that. We shouldn't need several nonprofits in every state of the country making millions of dollars to give a few medical appointments to a few women who are able to enter their program. And it's only temporary, so the women eventually are out of the program, and then what happens? They have been in operation for about 10 years now, and 40 other organizations do the exact same thing. And their kind of justification is that the money you give gets put back into the organization, which is how a business is run. If I go to Samsung, right, I buy a phone, okay? And the worker gets paid an hourly rate to make this phone. And they tell me, oh, this isn't a business, this is a charity, because the money you pay for this phone goes back to Samsung, to the operations of Samsung, so that these people can get paid a salary, an hourly rate, and they get to go to college at some point because we pay a part of their their training, or we also pay medical benefits. That's still a business. Like, why would you employ somebody like that? And their justification doesn't make sense. They are exploiting these women by paying them an hourly rate and taking the profits. Even if they are getting paid $20 an hour, the company is making $6 million. I went on their taxes, which you can find on GuideStar. It shows you, you can see how nonprofits spend their money. $1 million that you pay into this goes into programs that they create for people who have been given a first-time offense, for prostitution, or for soliciting, or for being caught with drugs, things like that. And they teach them that prostitution is bad, that it's harmful for society, and they get paid $1 million to do that. It's not going toward the women, it's going for somebody to teach people, oh, what you're doing is wrong, it's bad for society. So they really profit from criminalization. They profit from people being violently having sting operations done onto them by the police and having their record destroyed. These people who are being charged that first-time offense are going to have a hard time getting healthcare benefits and getting jobs. It's going to ruin their place in society. But they're getting to sit down and have this person tell them that they're bad people. And those people are getting paid $1 million to do that. That's not going to change anything. So I think the way we need to change the conversation is this idea, is to change it into a conversation where everybody is valued. So getting out of the illegal versus legal dichotomy and getting out of the whole, are you a perfect victim, are you a slave, or are you being exploited by labor, I think is like a really interesting way to have the conversation. I also think that we need to phrase it in something more revolutionary. So seeing it as a universal right for people to get health care, to get an education, to get housing would really change the dynamic and to stop persecuting people. Because the police, more often than not, they rape and kill sex workers. The way sting operations work, they have to get evidence of your illegal activity. So a lot of officers go in and they have sexual relations with the women. They pay them, and then they handcuff them and throw them into prison. These women are usually deported or imprisoned, or they're put into orphanages if they're underage. And those are underfunded as well. So for me, it just doesn't work, especially when you consider that Border Patrol last year murdered 4 women because they were sex workers, and he wanted to cleanse the community. Peter Cho, who is a councilman in Queens, said that he wanted to have police crack down on massage parlors because he wanted to clean up the neighborhood, because he didn't want children to see prostitutes soliciting. And then he did a convention where he talked about human trafficking and had the vice part of the police come in and say that human trafficking was prostitution, and that it happened online and in massage parlors. And in massage parlors, they racially profiled for Asian women. And it's just going to get very violent for us, and it's really not going to help us. I don't know if you guys have any questions. I'm sorry I talked so long.
I have a question.
Yes.
You started talking about, this has been extraordinary. This is a wonderful presentation, and I don't think you should question yourself. What are some ideas for solutions? I mean, you've talked about political ideas and very clearly stated that many times the so-called solutions are really profit centers, or they're not going to create solutions. So could you talk just a little bit, for really a layman, about what do you think the solutions might be? The steps, honest steps.
Mm-hmm. I think the first step is to listen to sex workers, which a lot of the times doesn't happen. A lot of the times people listen to nonprofit organizations that have been around for a really long time and that exclude sex workers from the conversation. Getting rid of Sesta Fosta, which has caused a crackdown on women online, and that has led to them to go on the streets. That's why it's especially tragic that they're doing crackdowns on women on the street, because that's where they're forced to go, a lot of them, that aren't privileged enough to find other sources of income. Also getting rid of the MAIN Act, and I don't know how to pronounce it, M-A-N-N, I think MAN. Yeah, the MAN Act, the White Slave Trafficking Act. Really focusing on listening to sex workers and what's going to help them, and also focusing on immigration is going to be your best bet, which unfortunately a lot of anti-immigrants, a lot of anti-trafficking organizations, they end up supporting anti-immigrant rhetoric. So, helping to create a pathway to citizenship for immigrants. One thing you could do right now, actually, is to fight to get immigrants the right to drive in New York State. A lot of immigrants have a hard time doing anything, dropping their kids off from school or going to work. Some of them take the risk on anyway and drive without a license because they can't get one and they need to drive, especially if you're out on Long Island. And that causes problems because if they get into an accident, they don't have insurance and they could be deported and get into a lot of trouble. But it would really, really help if if undocumented immigrants were able to get a driver's license, because then they would be able to go to the same process that we do. They would be trained on how to drive a vehicle, they would have to take the driving test, they would have to get insurance, they would have to have their vehicle registered, and that way if they get into an accident, it'll be fine, which is what I have. Yes.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story, and very effectively, and I really respect that, and your analysis of the system and how nonprofits can be complicit in that. We're in Flushing, and the Flushing neighborhood is kind of well known as a center of trafficking or a pipeline or something. They're usually talking about sex, but it's also labor trafficking, and trafficking is a global issue, challenge. So I think that looking at it as a many-headed reality and also concept. There are organized crime interests involved, and there is cruelty and exploitation. So while the state is, in some ways, as you were describing, mimicking the trafficking through its carceral system, there are real questions. So I'm not defending the idea about cracking down on women. Just coming over here, there was a woman who spoke to me in the street, and I thought, well, I have no idea what to do, if anything, to help women who are being exploited. I wouldn't call the police, I wouldn't call ICE, and now I'm wondering about some of these organizations, because they might do that. And so rather than just say, oh, I'm going to turn a blind eye, because we're faith communities, we're people who care here.
Yes.
And so I guess I'm wondering, what can be done also to be supported, but also to make sure that people aren't being mistreated.
Yes. I think for now...
Sorry for interrupting. Before you answer that question, I just want to make sure that Kate and I also have a chance to speak as well. So right after you answer, let's give them a chance to present their information.
Yes. I think for now we have to use the things that are in place. So there is temporary housing, there is clinics that help women, and lawyers, local legal stuff, so you can send them there. It's really awesome to have those connections. We do have pages on sex worker pages where you can go to places that are immigrant friendly, that are non-judgmental, and that they can go for temporary housing or long-term housing. So utilize those things for now, but make sure that you're fighting for long-term solutions. Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah, I'll say this. Thank you guys so much. Thank you very much for inviting us here. Like,